Your support helps us bring you programs you love. Go to wyomingpbs.org, click on Support, and become a sustaining member or an annual member. It's easy and secure. Thank you.
It's budget week during the budget session of the Wyoming Legislature. I'm Craig Blumenshine, and welcome to Capitol Outlook. On this packed program this evening, we'll hear from the minority leaders of the Wyoming House. That's Representative Cathy Connolly and Representative Charles Pelkey. We'll get a revenue update from the Senate Revenue Committee Chair, Cale. We'll visit again with two freshman legislators, Representative Sandy Newsome and Representative Cyrus Western, who are wading through their first budget. We'll have our weekly check-in with the majority leadership, and we'll meet Representative Sue Wilson in this week's Capitol Outlook profile. Capitol Outlook starts now.
This program is supported in part by a grant from the BNSF Railway Foundation, dedicated to improving the general welfare and quality of life in communities throughout the BNSF Railway service area. Proud to support Wyoming PBS.
By a grant from AARP, serving the needs and providing real possibilities for the over 50 population in Wyoming. AARP Wyoming. Proud to support Wyoming PBS.
And by Wyoming Humanities, celebrating our heritage, strengthening our democracy, and growing Wyoming's creative and cultural economy for over 50 years. Visit thinkwy.org.
And welcome as we begin our second week of Capitol Outlook from here in Cheyenne. We're pleased to be joined by the minority leadership in the Wyoming House of Representatives, the minority whip, Representative Charles Pelkey, and the minority floor leader, Representative Cathy Connolly. Welcome to both of you.
Morning, Craig.
It's a pleasure for me to have you with us today to get the minority perspective on a lot of things. We're going to talk about the budget. We're going to talk about some revenue ideas and maybe your reaction to what's transpired in the first week of the session as we move along today. But I want to start with the big news this week, which was Governor Gordon's announcement that the state might look into purchasing 1 million acres with maybe 4 million acres of mineral rights along the Transcontinental Railroad or the I-80 corridor. Purchase that land potentially from Occidental.
The issue that I have with thinking about it, I mean, it's an interesting idea. We're chatting a little bit ahead of time about, whoa, right and left are saying pretty much the same kind of things. Either whoa or huh. One of the things that occurred to me yesterday is when we were talking about kind of the budget and we were talking about benefits for state workers. It occurred to me that this land purchase, on one hand, it's about a strategy and a plan, but that's not it. You don't do something by a strategy and a plan. You do it by people. You do it by workers. And how are we managing our state lands? This would be an enormous amount of additional lands. And are we doing it well enough? Are we treating the people who implement the plans well enough? And I think the answer right now is no. And if we want to do this and we want to do it well, we need to be recruiting and retaining the best possible workers. And right now, we are at below median for wages, and we're cutting benefits.
Representative Pelkey, what did you feel when you first heard about this potential land buy?
I was intrigued. I think it's a positive to take some of that land out of private hands, but it depends on what we're going to do with it, how we're going to manage it. I'd like to see public access for recreation and hunting and so forth. But I have some concerns about how the land will be managed and what uses we plan for it.
Could be an amazing outlay of Wyoming's funds to make this acquisition, and a lot of unknowns about cost or return on investment or those other things. What are you going to be looking at? How will you be making that decision? You're going to be asked potentially within the next 6 months to give a thumbs up or thumbs down to this potential purchase.
I've been going back and forth on how that decision could or should be made. I probably will strongly advocate that we go into special session before, in all honesty, we deplete our liquid savings. I mean, it would really cost our LISRA. And so that is the kind of decision that I don't think just a handful of people on a select committee should be making. So I think we should go into special session in order to understand and bring back to our constituents what we're doing and how we're doing it.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think it's one of the most substantial expenditures that we've been looking at, and I don't think that it should be made by a small group of people.
In the context of the LISR, and we'll talk about it in just a moment, there's also another bill out there that may kick up an extra penny sales tax if the LISR falls below a certain number. We'll get to that in just a minute. I want to talk about the budget first. You've had the budget for a week on your desk or so. You've heard the first reading explanations. We're filming this on Wednesday morning, so you're going to start going through Second and Third Amendment readings soon. 4 years ago, you did not support the budget, either of you. 2 years ago, you did. At this point, does Wyoming have a good budget on your desks?
I think those past votes represent, the fact that our budgets tend to be a mixed bag. There are some areas that I feel comfortable with, others where I'm disappointed. I'm disappointed to see that benefits are being cut. The state contribution to health care for state employees is reduced in this budget. And I've yet to make a decision as to how I'm going to vote, or how our caucus is leaning at this point.
What have you thought, Representative Connolly, as you went through this time with the budget?
And I know we'll get to the bill that's out there in terms of kind of thinking about kind of our accounts, but to me they go together. And honestly, this is a budget that is pretty clean in terms of what are our revenue streams and what are our expenses. There haven't been too many cuts to agencies, but on the other hand, what's really disappointing to me is that there's very little innovation in this budget. We do not see kind of expansion of needed programs. We don't see reorganization in a way to promote efficiencies. We're not seeing that in this budget. So it's a meh budget. It's a meh budget at this point.
Is that disappointing to you that
it is?
That we know, you all know, the fiscal challenges that are sitting here for Wyoming, yet this budget essentially pushes that decision down the road a little bit.
Yeah, and that's what's really disappointing to me. I'm sure that I had a couple of bills out there that would have addressed revenue streams. One was on income tax. I wanted to continue having that discussion. It didn't even make it for an introductory vote. The one that did make it for an introductory vote was on sales tax. So instead of moving to a bill that actually kind of has a whole lot of triggers and spending policies and what happens with the LISR when we get to $500,000, that bill would have simply raised our sales tax by a penny, from 4% to 5% on a statewide level, distributed with about 2/3 to the general fund, 1/3 to locals. It would have raised $400 million over the biennium. It would have solved the issues that we have right now, and it died. It's very disappointing to me that we are continuing to not actually take the structural deficit seriously.
How do we take it seriously?
Well, we take it seriously by looking at the revenue side. I mean, as Cathy said, a single penny sales tax would have raised $400 million over the biennium. The fact is that we have people who are committed, either by pledge or just personal philosophy, not to raise taxes in any way, even though we have a declining revenue from minerals. And so I'm disappointed that we're not taking a serious look at the revenue picture. I mean, a couple of years ago, we had a package of measures that would have changed tax structure in the state, and they were all out rejected. I mean, I think and I'm not on that committee, Cathy is, but I mean, I think revenue has got to be one of the most frustrating committees to be on. You'll work 6 months, 9 months on very thoughtful packages, and they're just rejected out of hand.
A little bit later in today's show, we're going to visit with Senator Cale, the chairman of the Senate Revenue Committee, and talk about many of these issues. But here comes House Bill 186, titled simply the K-12 and Local Government Structural Deficit Repair Act. It's easy, right? Pass the bill, problems are solved. But one of the things, as we alluded to earlier, that this bill might do is implement a statewide extra penny sales tax if the legislative reserve account falls below $500 million. And it does some other things as well. But most predict that at current spending levels, that will happen. Is this a good bill?
It's a bill that honestly kind of kicks the decisions down the road. It's a bill, honestly, that says this legislature, the individuals in it, don't have to do anything right now. We are pushing the issues to the future, and we're setting up a bunch of triggers for the future. I don't like that. Right? I like us taking responsibility for solving problems. This bill really doesn't do it. It understands what's going to happen, what's likely to happen. If you go back to our original discussion about if we do the land purchase, it triggers immediately, I would imagine. I would rather have had us actually have the kind of discussion about just implementing a sales tax, thinking about property tax assessments, all of those other issues that are fair and immediate.
Is this better than nothing, Representative Pelkey?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I agree that it's sort of kicking the issue down the road, but at least there's a safety net if this is implemented. And, you know, I'm not real happy with the bill, but as you say, it's better than nothing at this point.
Last topic that I'm sure you're both very disappointed in. Medicaid expansion has failed twice essentially in this legislature. You're both proponents of Medicaid expansion. Yeah. What's Wyoming's solution to assist those in need with health care?
You know, aside from Medicaid expansion, we don't really have a solution. We've made small incremental allocations to help rural healthcare facilities, but you know, frankly, we've left $500 million on the table, and you know, the numbers indicate that states that don't adopt Medicaid expansion suffer the consequences. Healthcare, the quality of healthcare declines, the cost goes up, and we have a solution sitting right in front of us, but for ideological reasons, the legislature isn't willing to adopt it.
Some people thought it had momentum coming into the session, and it turned out it really didn't.
So it passed out of the Revenue Committee because honestly, we on the Revenue Committee saw that we had an absolute need, not only for taking care of our people, which I think should always be at the center of how we think about it, but it would have brought in $200 million for an investment of 20. Where else do you get an ROI like that? You know, you ask the question of what's the solution. So, you know, honestly, I sat back and thought for a second. I like the question because the question acknowledges that there's a problem. And you know what the solution would be? That we take $200 million out of the general fund or the LISRA and we put it into the Department of Health. We're not going to do that. And so we don't have a solution as far as I'm concerned.
As we go, any issues that you want to make sure are dealt with in this session before the session expires here in just a few weeks?
I was pleased that I served on the coal bankruptcy task force. We will have a couple of bills that come out that I think will be important for communities that, and in all honesty, we expect for there to be other bankruptcies in the state. And a taxation scheme that kind of left tens of millions of dollars not being paid to local communities will change if and when we pass those bills. And
I would rather pay my sales tax 18 months from now, by the way.
Well, that's what they've been
when I
able
go to the store today.
Yes, that's what they've been able to do, and these bills would kind of allow for a transition period, but then monthly payment of those taxes, so that's good.
Top of your plate?
I'm on Judiciary. I still think criminal justice reform is critical. You know, we have a declining crime rate in Wyoming, but we have an increasing prison population. And I think Judiciary over the last couple of years has done some good work. The majority of those, or the majority of the problem lies not in the number of convictions and subsequent imprisonments. It's oftentimes parole violations, and again, substance abuse related. And we suddenly see people going back to prison for having an addiction problem, and we're addressing it, I think, a little bit more intelligently. But we have a long way to go on that front.
To both of you, thank you. Thank you for your flexibility in visiting with us, Representative Charles Pelkey and Representative Cathy Connolly, the top two members in the minority leadership of the Wyoming House of Representatives.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We're on to talk more about revenue. Senator Cale Case is with us next. He's the chairman of the Senate Revenue Committee. Stay with us. And we continue on with week 2 of Capital Outlook from here in Cheyenne, and it's my pleasure to be joined by the Senate Chairman of the Revenue Committee, Senator Cale Case. Welcome.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
We had hoped to have your colleague, Representative Zwanitzer, with us, who's the chairman of the House Revenue Committee. He had some scheduling issues, so we're gonna go on solo here, if that's all right.
We'll do the best we can.
I wanted to ask you about a comment that was made a little bit earlier in the show by Representative Pelkey. He said that the Revenue Committee must be one of the most frustrating committees to be on. They spend 6-9 months on very thoughtful packages, and they're just rejected out of hand. And we've all watched the Revenue Committee work for a long time that really does put a lot of time and effort into bills that are really just not considered, almost. What are your thoughts as the leader of this committee?
Well, you have to have a lot of patience, and it is frustrating at times. It's not just when we get the legislative session, because we've had brutal discussions and battles within the committee to get us this far. So, there have been many other proposals on the table that went off the Revenue Committee. It just has to be done. I feel like it's one of my special services in the legislature that it's kind of my turn in the barrel. I love my former committee. I was chairman of corporations. Mm-hmm. Man, that was a beautiful duty compared to revenue, where everybody seems to be against some of the solutions we're proposing, but Wyoming really does need us to propose solutions. So here we are, and I'm ready to take the criticism.
And here we are. It seems to me that the state, and I mean maybe the legislature, maybe the citizens, we don't understand really what our revenue needs are. Do you agree with that?
We're just starting to come to grips with the huge changes that are happening to Wyoming. As the world moves to a lower carbon emission platform, and we all band together to combat global warming, Wyoming is in a position where we've got to make some radical changes, and we have to adapt to a different time and a different priorities in the world. And we need to make fundamental changes in our spending and fundamental changes in the way that we raise revenue.
How should that discussion go forward after this session? Most, I think, classify this budget as maybe a status quo budget, if you will, for lack of a better descriptor, that really puts these hard conversations off till later. Deserved? Is that way to describe the budget and the conversation deserved?
I think it's very much deserved. I think we've kind of hidden from the realities that are beginning to hit us. And I liken this to someone that they know their plant is closing down and they've been put on half time, so they're only getting half a paycheck, but yet they've decided to spend all their savings down before they go look for another job. That's where we're at. And that's not right, because those savings really don't belong to us. They represent money that we've put away to compensate future generations for their loss of mineral opportunities. And if we spend it all now, they're not going to have it.
Going forward this interim, what's your responsibility then in this conversation?
Well, continue the education process, bring forward proposals, try to get people to realistically adapt both our budget and our revenue abilities to the new realities out here in the world. So that we're going to need to reduce spending in government, and we're going to need to develop new revenue sources, and really look at the things that we sell now, that are going to be sold by Wyoming in future years. We know that we're not going to be producing much coal. The last quarter was, again, a disastrous quarter. Our production has gone from 460 million tons to less than 300 tons per year in just a very short drop, and it's still dropping. So can't count on that. Natural gas prices are low. The forecast, we use an official forecast for Craig, it's $1 above, $1 an MCF above where gas is now, and has every prospect of being for the intermediate future. Mm-hmm. And so we've kind of put our whole thing on an oil play that is very risky, because it depends on national politics in terms of the ability to drill and produce oil with our federal partners who either own the mineral rights or own the surface.
So what's the role of Power Wyoming, the governor's initiative, relative to the Revenue Committee, you and the legislature, in carrying forward this what I think is going to be a very difficult conversation.
I commend the governor for starting the Power Wyoming, and it's an attempt to really look at what this future economy and tax structure needs to be. And Representative Zawanaser and myself have served kind of an advisory role. We've been to a lot of the meetings and just talking, but it's trying to provide good data about really what we're talking about. What are our risks and what will happen as coal continues to decline? It's not an unknown. You can really dial it in and see which plants are scheduled to close and how much they burn, and you can figure out how much wind and solar development there'll be and what the tax revenues on that are. And I'm afraid they're not much. We need to do a better job of taxing those. But it's a chance to lay it out on the table and use it to educate folks. And I commend the governor for tackling it.
It seems to me that if people are going to pay attention to anything in this interim period, it's going to be that effort. And I think it's that important. Would you agree?
Yes. So that data has been presented to our committee, the Revenue Committee. We've had 3 different presentations, and we continue to mine that data better. And it continues to be updated in terms of every forecast of future revenues has looked worse.
Yeah.
It doesn't look better.
Could also use a lot of savings that Wyoming has. Your view on how this might march forward?
So I don't look at that as using up savings. Let's be clear here. We have investments. We have a portfolio of over $8 billion that it's used to permanently provide for the future of Wyoming. And that portfolio, when it started out, was mostly fixed income instruments, didn't pay very much. We've expanded it and grown it into equities, and that's been very helpful. It truly has provided good income and capital gains for the state. This is the next step. Most balanced portfolios, investment portfolios, this is called a sovereign wealth fund. You know, when you get so big, you get in a different league.
And Wyoming's is big.
It is big. It's one of the, we're so fortunate, sure. And we can thank our forefathers for putting this together. But this is a tool, another investment. It balances, a 3-part portfolio: fixed incomes, equities, and real property. And this is a chance to really do a lot of good things if it's done well. And, I think I'll be criticized back in my hometown of Lander because it might expose us to some carbon risk because there's certainly oil and gas production about it. But this trona part that is amazing, that we do enjoy a royalty on most of the trona production, that is so significant. And that could be worth a whole deal down the road and truly do something for future generations. Those trona reserves are phenomenal, the best on the planet. It's a really an important mineral in combating global warming.
You're hosting panel discussions today, and we're filming this on Thursday, so they will already have occurred once Capital Outlook airs this week. But what's your reason for that, and what do you hope to accomplish?
Well, there's a lot of changes in Wyoming's world with regard to electricity and the future of generation as we combat global warming and move towards renewable energy. Wyoming's got a huge stake in that. We export tremendous amount of electricity. Most of the production in Wyoming is exported. Within Rocky Mountain Power's territory, 85% of the electricity production is exported. And as the coal-fired plants ratchet down, produce less, run less often, you can see that there's still interest in producing electricity in Wyoming, but it's going to come from renewables like wind and solar. Now, we have the most open space of the lower 48, and we're looking at the wind and solar development in a very simplistic way that really just looks at local economic development, which is a flash flurry up front with no real sustained benefits. And they do pay property tax, and they do pay sales tax. I'm grateful for that. But we all know that our property taxes are very small in Wyoming compared to other places, and our sales tax is as well. Unfortunately, the ongoing employment and contribution to local economies is not very big. So you get this flurry up front, an injection of funds which everybody seems to be looking at, but not thinking about the long-term impacts in terms of our landscape, our wildlife, our tax structure, And so I think we have to be more responsible.
Interesting discussions coming for sure. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
We look forward now to our weekly conversation with the leadership of the Wyoming Legislature. Of course, that's Senate President Drew Perkins and the Speaker of the House, Steve Harshman. That's next. Stay with us. And as we continue with our second week of Capitol Outlook here in Cheyenne, it's our pleasure to have our weekly conversation with the President of the Senate and the Speaker of the House. Gentlemen, welcome back to Capitol Outlook.
Thank you, Craig.
Thanks
for having us.
You're sure
thanks for
welcome.
having us.
The big news this week, of course, you were part of. You were at the news conference where the governor announced a potential land purchase from Occidental Petroleum of 1 million acres along the Transcontinental Railroad corridor. That is a huge play for Wyoming. What were your thoughts when you were sitting there next to the governor and he was talking about this potential purchase?
It's just exciting. I've known about it for a little while. We've been working this behind the scenes. It's just the stars have aligned for this, and I think it's potentially a game changer in Wyoming. And just from its income value alone is significant. I mean, as a landowner, you'd be getting royalties off Trona, off oil and gas, off any kind of mineral out there, and there's lots of minerals in that swath, many of which are already being developed, particularly in the Trona patch. So it's a valuable piece of income producing property as well. But when you take it to the point of being a public entity, the state of Wyoming and the people of Wyoming, there are so many synergies with 1 million acres of surface to find ways to open up access, to find ways to develop and have pipeline or transmission corridors, to open up land for recreation, for conservation, for migration corridors, for sage grouse.
I'm guessing that folks are watching and wondering, and as they hear more about this, you look at what's the return on investment? When am I going to make my money back? How much is it going to cost? And these are answers that just really aren't known, Mr. Speaker. How's the state going to purchase this?
Well, that's the next question, I think, and it's got to be a process. First of all, you got to buy it somehow.
Somehow.
And it's not like, we've got some significant cash. You could make some of this your investment portfolio, but all that's got to pass a prudent investor standard. You can't just, and so we've got an obligation to make returns for the parts of state government that depend on that. We have constitutional obligations to it. So how do you buy it? And I think that is going to remain to be seen. And the president's right. I think the potential is tremendous, but we are in a structural deficit. And so I'm concerned that we don't make that worse, that we somehow do this in a way that we pay for it and we buy it, and not that I don't want to borrow to do it. We've got this fiscal cliff that's coming. Unless the price of oil goes up to 60 or 70, then everything will be fine. It's coming, and it's 4 or 5 years away. I don't want this purchase to make that 6 months away, and that's a concern of mine. And so you can't take all of your bank account and put it on this, because the return is not going to be instant. This is a generational return, right? So people are reaching out to me. The comments are, "Hey, this is great, but I thought we were in fiscal crisis." And so I think we gotta figure out how we're going to do this.
So let's talk about that if we could. How will this proceed? I mean, we're at the end of February now. We just got 3 more weeks left in this session. We've been told now that this decision probably will have to be made in the next few months because it's time and transactions like this have to happen, relatively quickly, I would assume. Mr. President, how's this going to work for the state of Wyoming? How is this process going to play out to whether the trigger will be pulled to make the purchase?
First of all, there'll have to be an analysis, much along the lines of what the speaker just talked about. The value, whenever there's a big acquisition like this, the first thing you do is you hire people who know what they're doing. And so the governor's office, the SLIB board, the State Loan and Investment Board, has reached out and talked to, and they found an investment banker that will help them. The reason you need that is because before you do this, you have to answer all the questions the speaker just raised. I can tell you that most of the value from the state's perspective will be in what is it in income, because it's not just to hold land for land's sake. This is an income investment, and we don't have the 25 or 30% of real estate in the state's investment portfolio now. We probably should, but the reason you have that is for 2 things. One, it provides a more ready and state of return than it does by investing in bonds and stocks on Wall Street. So if you have, you're as a landlord, as a landowner, you're entitled to rents, you're entitled to royalties, you're entitled to these steady streams of income that come through. And so one of the things you do that is you value that land in the context of what income does it provide to you, and both now and future income. I can tell you I've seen some of the numbers, which are at this point confidential, but the largest valuation from, at least from Oxy's standpoint, are royalties off of minerals. And it's not, and the majority of it's not oil and gas. The majority of that value comes from other minerals.
Trona and other minerals.
Trona and other, particularly Trona. And so the Trona deposits out there are vast. They're some of the best in the world. They're actively being exploited now, and so a lot of those royalties are being paid to Oxy now. So, but in looking at all that, there's so many things that have to be answered in this as you move forward. But you've got to establish the value, and then in addition to establishing the value off income, you look at what are called synergies in these types of acquisitions. What are the synergies the state of Wyoming can realize that maybe a privately held company doesn't? And you look at those. Those are the things like the availability for investment, for the things I just talked about, pipeline corridors, conservation, migration corridors, sage-grouse. All those things are synergies the state has that aren't necessarily synergies for a privately held company. And the last thing I would say is the other thing, a classic example of that synergy is you would have now, instead of these broad swaths of land and minerals being held by a multinational corporation where those lands have changed hands now 3 times in the last 30 years, you're talking about having a steady state, a steady ownership where that's owned by the people of Wyoming.
We just have a couple minutes left in this segment. So are we looking at a special session to say up or down, or will we leave this session with all of the tools in place for the executive or someone to make the purchase? How will this play out relative to the legislature?
The way the bill's written now is that really could be both. We're going to give them all the tools, but they've got to give us a 60-day notice that this is what we've got. And so we can call ourselves back into special session if we want to change that, or if we, but that's the way it is now. It could go either way, really. If it comes out and everybody looks at it and says this is a good deal, and then we wouldn't gather again. And but I think that part's probably that's going to be hard enough. That's going to be really hard, and there's a lot of work because it's a big deal. And the opportunities are tremendous, but you got to find a way to pay for it. We paid for Alaska somehow, right? And we paid for the Louisiana Purchase. It wasn't through some deal where we bankrupted ourselves. And I just want us to be really careful because we've got fiscal challenges, and so I want to find a way that we can say yes to this deal and get it done, and it'll. It'll be, like I said, intergenerational type move.
So we just have about a minute left. Each of you were here late last night. Last night was Wednesday night after second reading budget amendments. But I think you both felt pretty good about the way these amendments went through your particular bodies. The decorum, the debate, and what transpired. Do you agree?
I agree. I was proud in a lot of respects. I was surprised at some of the votes and some of the outcome. But for the most part, the debates were well thought out. Both sides of many issues were aired completely, and it was an interesting night. It was very deliberate and methodical how we went through those budget amendments. And like I say, I was surprised at some of the outcomes. But it's the process, and it would actually work fairly well last night.
Mr. Speaker?
Yeah, I think same thing. I was really proud of the House of Representatives. I thought it was one of our better days, and I think the debate is getting better and better. So it's part of this process. And you win some, you lose some. I didn't agree with all of them, obviously, but we're going to have another third reading will be Friday on this, and then we'll get together and try to work out the differences. But it's a beautiful process. It's just a tough process, and you go late into the night and you work hard at it.
And there were committee meetings, at least on the House side, after.
Yeah,
you
we
guys
did.
adjourned after 10 o'clock.
We rolled out here about 11 o'clock last night. So
very late night. Well, be more to talk about as the session continues. Thank you both for
Yeah.
making time for us today. I know how packed your schedules are. Thanks for joining us.
No,
Thank you,
thanks.
Craig.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
We're going to now meet Representative Sue Wilson. She's our Capital Outlook profile. That's next. And we continue our tradition of interviewing legislators in their homes in our Capital Outlook profile, and we're pleased to be joined by Representative Sue Wilson.
Glad to have you here.
Thank you so much for hosting us today. It's a pleasure. You're with House District 7 is who your constituents are, and you were elected in 2013.
That's right.
And that was the first time you'd ever ran for office.
It was, actually.
What motivated you?
I had no
to serve?
such thought of doing any such thing.
And something changed.
That's right. So it's an interesting story. Some people say, oh, I always wanted to run for something. And I never was really thinking of that. But I was teaching social studies at a private school here in Cheyenne. And I found that, you're always telling the students, the government is us, the government isn't them. And when I retired from doing that, I thought, well, it would be interesting to follow up on what's happening in healthcare in the state, because that was my background. And I just, you say periodically, don't just sit on the sofa and whine, right? Get up off the sofa, do something. And so I decided to run, and it was the strangest thing, seeing 4-foot signs with my name on them along the side of the road. Who does that?
Was it nervous for you when you were out campaigning? Is that out of your comfort zone, or did you enjoy that?
No, having taught school for a while and done other things, that was, going door to door was fine. And of course, I had lived in the district for a while. I knew people. No, I was comfortable with that.
Let's go back to your childhood. I think we're in the home of a certified cheesehead. Am I right about that?
This is true. I grew up in Wisconsin. So the Packers all the way. Boy, Super Bowl.
Uh-huh. And tell me about your high school days. What did you like to do?
Well, I was kind of a quiet, nerdy kid, I guess. A lot of reading, Spanish club president, that kind of thing. Tutored algebra and Spanish and in high school. I grew up in Wisconsin. And
did you travel much, or did you stay close to home?
Well, we would go on summer vacation and all, but my family was not really well off. And, we would go visit relatives and that kind of thing, but not I was never on an airplane until I came home for Christmas break from college.
Wow.
But so as I was getting ready to graduate from college, so University of Wisconsin is right downtown from my house, so I applied there, and then I applied at Yale and I applied at Stanford. And got in at all three. I never actually even saw the Yale campus or the Stanford campus before my family wasn't the kind that could do college tours all over the place and look at them. So as a matter of fact, when my mom drove me back east for the beginning of classes at Yale, I had never been east of Chicago in my life.
I've heard you say before that tuition at Yale was more than your family's annual income.
Yes, it was. I had a large scholarship.
What was it like for you to step on that campus? Give me an idea of what Sue from rural Wisconsin coming to Yale.
Well, there's a real variety of people, certainly, on the campus. There were 4 of us in a little suite, and so there was me, and then there was a gal from Cincinnati whose dad was the CEO of a company that was listed on the American Stock Exchange, and over spring break, she complained how difficult it was to pack because she had to pack for the ski part of the vacation and then to go to Florida for the beaches. And
some people have all the problems, don't they?
Actually, I wasn't going anywhere for spring break because I couldn't afford to go anywhere. And then I had the third roommate was a kid from outside of Philadelphia who played field hockey and lacrosse, and then the fourth one was from Toledo, and her parents had immigrated from China. Her older brother had been born in China, and they ran a Chinese restaurant in Toledo. So, that's a big variety. And then down the hall, there was a young man from Pakistan and one from Bangladesh and some kids from California, all sorts. So
what sort of extracurricular activities did you become involved with in college?
I played rugby.
Rugby player.
Yes,
wow.
I think must have been the start to my legislative career. Was playing rugby.
You're used to that contact now.
That's right. Intramural soccer,
You became a fencer somewhere along the way.
I did. That was at the very end. I did take one fencing class the end of senior year, but I was second semester senior year. The coach was from Soviet Georgia, and he was very old school. Didn't let you have a foil until second semester, which meant for a whole semester, Monday afternoon, I was supposed to just go back and forth up the mat, pointing with your finger. And so I bagged that, but that led to me leading my husband years later. But
well, let's talk about after college, then what?
Right, so I went back to Wisconsin, worked at a hospital for a couple of years. My college degree, my first college, I have 2 bachelor's degrees, but the first one was in psychology, which is really a sort of a useless kind of degree. But I went back and worked as a unit clerk in the hospital for a couple of years. My uncle was a physician, and I had, was interested. I didn't really want to go to med school after I took chemistry. I said, well, maybe I don't want to do that. But I was kind of interested in healthcare administration, and so worked for 2 years, and then went back to grad school in Wisconsin, and then did a postgraduate administrative residency down in New Orleans, which is where I met my husband. And so then kind of a combination of Coast Guard wife, healthcare administration, moving all around the country. So we met in New Orleans, where I was working at a big hospital, 500-bed hospital. Then we moved to Florida, 2 places in Florida. I worked in public health there. We moved to California. I worked in long-term care. And we moved to New Jersey, where I was a mid-level manager at the time, where I was in a very small town and there was no mid-level management, so I worked at a garden center. And then I was home with my kids.
We'll get to your gardening expertise here in just a little bit. Was your husband a fencer?
He was a fencer.
Who wins those battles? What do you call them? Do you call them matches or battles?
Once we started dating, we didn't fence each other anymore.
That sure seems to me there would be some concern there. My spouse had a foil, as you say, on opposite me.
Well, he has longer reach, but I think my eye-hand coordination is faster. But we haven't fenced in kind of a while.
You have also mentioned that you noticed in the Wyoming legislature there's somewhat of a lack of expertise in health care, which you have a significant background in, and that also somewhat motivated you to run.
That was one of the main motivators. At the time when I was thinking of running, we had 2 nurses and an optometrist and a veterinarian. And so even now, as far as health, out of the 90 legislators, we've got a veterinarian, retired physician, a physician assistant, and me, who I'm not a clinician, but I have the master's in healthcare administration. And healthcare is such an issue across a rural state like this. That's one of the things I enjoy about being able to serve in the legislature, is just to bring some understanding of healthcare issues.
Tell our viewers you're now the chairman of the Labor, Health, and Social Services Committee of the legislature.
That's right.
You've been an artist in your career.
You can't see it from the camera, but there's some of my works are.
So you'll have to. We'll show our viewers Sue Wilson originals here as we move along.
I don't have that much time to paint. As a matter of fact, I still have some things I started doing when my daughter, my youngest, was going to start. I think kindergarten or first grade. I thought, I'll have more time to paint now, because it's hard to paint when your kids are little. They're always running around, mucking around with the paintbrushes and stuff like that. But I've been just so busy, I just don't really have time to do some of those things I love.
You're a wonderful gardener.
I do love to garden. Oh boy, if I ever have to give up gardening, I don't know, I may just lay down and die. But no, I start a lot of things from seed in my little south windows, and I'm out in the garden as much as I can.
And tell me, why do you think you enjoy it so much?
I don't know, and my dad was a gardener growing up, but of course as a child you resist what your parents try to have you do, like they make you weed, and we didn't want to weed. But, there's just something about the connection with the soil and making things grow and being able to, I tell people I love to eat from my yard. I have apple trees too, and it's just very satisfying.
Very difficult to do things at 6,500 plus feet.
It's a challenge. But if you're a gardener, you're always a sucker to keep trying. I keep trying to grow cantaloupe here in Cheyenne at 6,200 feet, and I have not. I did get one about this big once. I know you can grow cantaloupe in Torrington, because I had a friend whose uncle grew them there, but I haven't had some. But if you pick the right tomato varieties, and so I got tomatoes and carrots and Swiss chard and all sorts of things, but I haven't had any luck with cantaloupe yet.
So you know Spanish.
Hablo español.
Yeah, and
¿Quieres que hagamos la entrevista en español?
Tell us what you just said.
I asked if you had to do the interview in Spanish.
No.
No, that's good. That's good. But we want the listeners to be able to understand too.
My couple years of junior high Spanish doesn't equate to
That's
what you
right.
do, but
That's
this
good you
is
took it in
a
junior high.
vocation for you.
That it came about in, people ask me, well, where'd you learn your Spanish? And I just started in 7th grade like your average kid and took it through junior high and high school, and then I took some in college. Then I was fortunate enough, with my husband being in the Coast Guard, we lived in South Florida. I had Puerto Rican and Cuban coworkers, and we lived in California, and I had various Mexican patients sometimes. But I really love languages. I mean, I took German as well, and actually I'm learning a little bit of Hebrew right now. But when I was teaching Spanish and social studies at the school here in Cheyenne, people would come to me with these things. Can you translate this? I had a friend, I was at the housing authority. Would you do? And I thought eventually, maybe I could get paid to do this. So I was teaching teenagers all week, and I had my own teenagers, and I started to felt like I had maybe too many teenagers in my life. And so I retired from school and opened my translation business. So it's document translation. I've done a lot of medical records, of course.
So people send documents, email
by
documents
email.
to you?
I tell you, I should be the poster child for the broadband project or something, because it's my laptop, my brain, and the internet. And if any of those fail, then I'm done for. But I've only ever met like 1 or 2 of my clients in person, and I've been doing this for, 10 years now.
You mentioned just briefly that you had spent some time in Florida. And we had talked previously about that was at the beginning of the AIDS epidemic. You were in Key West.
Right.
And
I was the business manager for the county health department in Key West.
Must have been a challenging time.
Well, it was very hard because really the medications they were starting to try to see what medications could be used. If you think back, if you're our age, like dentists didn't used to wear the masks or the gloves. The whole way to take care of yourself and prevent. People were not even fully sure of transmission routes. So we had in Key West, which had a population of 20,000 people, roughly the size of Laramie, we had 120 full-blown HIV
proportionally than San Francisco, per se.
More proportionally than San Francisco. Wow. And so that was one of, I had many things that I was in charge of, but the AIDS patient care contracts was one of the things that I was responsible for, working with the advocacy groups, finding a primary care provider that would be willing to see the patients, finding dental care for the people, right. The public health experience down there was
challenging time for you?
It was challenging. It was interesting. A lot of those public health issues sort of stayed with me. Public health is one of the oldest healthcare. It's really one of the oldest functions of government. If you think back, you look at like in the Old Testament or in Roman times, the public health and the wells. Public health is one of the oldest functions of government, other than starting wars, say.
Representative Wilson, it's a pleasure to visit with you this morning. And
glad to have you here.
We are very, very thankful for your service, and thank you for joining us on this Capital Outlook.
Glad to have you here.
And as we hit the home stretch of our second week of Capital Outlook, we're pleased to be joined by, is it sophomore legislators now? Is that the proper terminology?
I think we're still freshmen because
Still
it's our
freshmen.
It's the freshman term,
Yep.
the second year of the freshman term.
Yep.
Representative Cyrus Western and Representative Sandy Newsome, welcome to both of you.
Thanks for having us.
We're going to get to the budget, which this is budget week, of course, in the Wyoming legislature in just a minute. But I want to talk to you also, and we've talked to others in our program, about the big news this week, which was Governor Gordon's announcement that the state might look at acquiring 1 million acres of land along the I-80 corridor, along the Transcontinental Railroad corridor, and what that might mean to revenues. And as legislators, you're going to have to make decisions, obviously, about this soon, maybe even in a special session we hear later this summer. When you first heard of this idea, and Representative Newsome, let me start with you. What went through your mind?
Well, when we first heard about it, I didn't know the scope, that it was almost 1 million acres. And I'm startled at that number. But all state lands are used to fund schools. So as we go forward and we have school funding issues, is this a long-term solution for school funding? I have to look a little bit more carefully at what the resources that are there, would they generate revenue for our schools? How much does it cost? What's the return on investment? There's a lot of we don't knows right now, but it certainly is worth exploring.
I think one thing we do know is it'll be a large capital outlay, Representative Western.
It will be. I mean, whether it's $700 million or $1 billion, that's a lot of taxpayer money that we're talking here. I think with any opportunity, it needs to be seriously looked at, but I think it needs to pass the smell test. I think we need to look at this from a business perspective and a business transaction. This is something that's going to generate cash flow, that's going to generate revenue for taxpayers for years to come. And it's, you kind of have to go through the normal procedures of if you're doing any kind of purchase of a major asset, whether it be oil and gas or mineral rights we're talking here, or whether it's commercial real estate. Does the price justify the amount of revenue that it brings in, right? I think we need to apply a lot of the normal business metrics that any small business owner or any large corporation would do when they're looking at a major purchase. So is it going to cash flow sustainably over a certain amount of time, or is the cash flow going to be kind of all over the place? Is it going to go in cycles? I really will see this as it comes down to the price. If we can get it for the right price, I think this could be a lot of value and it could generate a lot of cash flow for the state. But I think if they're asking too much money, we need to be able to walk away and say this is not beneficial in the long run for taxpayers.
Let's move on to the budget. And the reason I wanted to have you both on is this is your first budget. You are freshman legislators for sure. And this is the first budget you've seen. Representative Newsome, you told me a year ago when we visited, when you were new here to Cheyenne, that you weren't sure whether Wyoming was fiscally responsible, but you were still learning.
I am still I think
now
it's a lifetime
you've got this
of learning.
budget on your desk here, and you've had first reading of the budget. You'll consider second and third reading amendments. What's going through your mind?
It's a lot of money. Overall, if you count all the funds, it's $11 billion. If you count the general fund, it's just under $3 billion, 2.9794, something like that. And and there's a lot of moving parts, and a lot of this goes here and that goes there. So it's nice for us to have the budget presented in the way it's presented. And as I understand it, this is the first year that we've had the budget for a week before we start talking about it. So we had a chance to dig into it, where last year when we had the supplemental budget, we kind of got it one day, we started on it the next, we were on second and third reading really quickly. So it's, for what I understand, quite a luxury to have it for this week and be able to talk with people and be able to ask questions as you go through it kind of on your own or with your group of constituents or group of people to say, are we spending this wisely? Is this a wise move? It's a lot of information in a very short time, even though we've had it for a week. But I think that we're doing a good job with the money.
So you're ready to say this is a good budget?
I'm ready to say this is worth working on. I'm ready to say there are things that we need to tweak. There are things that are not, and there are things that we'll pass through that aren't perfect in every way. But certainly we are living within our means. We're still looking at cuts. I spent time on the Efficiency Commission this summer in the interim and learned a lot about the efficiencies. That commission sent $85 million worth of cuts and efficiencies to the governor to incorporate in his budget, and he did a lot of those. And so everybody's trying to work. The Efficiency Commission, in my estimation, should have happened when we had bucket loads of money, because that's when you get inefficient, is when you have a bunch of money. So the Efficiency Commission, in my estimation, was a little bit late in starting, but that it should have started when we had a bunch of money to make it so those inefficiencies didn't happen in the first place.
And maybe feel less under the gun, right?
Right, and maybe have more money in savings at this point.
Representative Western, you described previous times a year ago that when the legislature was trigger happy, when times were really good. But then you also said about this budget that this is more or less a status quo budget that brings us one step closer to a budget crisis. You've had it for a week. Do you still feel that way?
I think, generally speaking, yes. If you look at this budget and how we're spending money, the amount that we're spending, if you look at this budget, it doesn't go way over the average of what we've been spending. So this isn't really opening up the cash valve and spending money, like drunken sailors. But also, we're probably going to take right around $300 million out of savings to fill that deficit, which spending from savings it's an effective short-term strategy. So we can get away with it for a little while, but once spending runs out, then what do we do? If you're one of those people that wants to cut your way out of this budget, I would say this budget isn't quite there. But also, if you're on the other side of the spectrum, if you want to raise revenue and tax your way out of this deficit, I wouldn't say this one does that either. So if you look at where we're at, we're kind of right in that status quo range of what the budget is spending.
Your committee was challenged to look at Hot Springs State Park and asked to review and explore innovative ways to implement the statewide concession master plan. Give us a status update on what's happening at Hot Springs State Park, if you could.
So Hot Springs State Park is in Thermopolis and is home of the world's largest hot springs, and a really big buffalo herd.
Yeah.
And so what's happened there over the years is that we have long-term contracts with concessionaires, and they have kind of let their properties decline. And so as we look at how do we make that the jewel of Wyoming that it should be, we look at how are our concession contracts executed, making those have touch points, have what's the word I want? Conditions periodically. So every 5 years, every 3 years, we check in on them and make sure that the maintenance is being done and all those things. And that has not happened. Pretty much it's been, here's your 30-year contract and
we'll see you in 30 years.
We'll see you in 30 years. So we try to, and throughout the state parks, to have a consistent concession contract so that the state parks know what they're looking for. But as far as Hot Springs State Park, it could be really cool, and it's not right now.
What's the state's role then in making it cool, if the state has a role?
Well, the state needs to find concessionaires that will have hotels, have the swimming pools, and do a super good job.
Is that doable?
I believe so. I believe that there are concessionaires that are in other parts of the state that are doing a good job, and I think that if they chose to bid on the Hot Springs State Park, and if there was some state funding to support that could be really great. And as far as tourism, that's a growth industry in Thermopolis for sure.
And in Wyoming.
And in all of Wyoming.
And as a kid who spent days and days and days in those pools, I'm certainly hopeful and wish you the best to have success there.
From our trip from Cody to Denver, or Cody to Sterling, Colorado, where I grew up to see our folks, that's a stopping off point for us both ways, coming and going.
Much more to visit with, but I'm sorry that we're out of time. But thank you so much for being so flexible. We've rescheduled this interview a couple of times, and the great thing about Wyoming legislators, I've always said, is that you are flexible and you don't shy away. We just try to make it work. So thank you very much, Representative Sandy Newsome and Representative Cyrus Western. Thank you so much for joining us. And that's a wrap for our second week of Capital Outlook from the 2020 budget session of the Wyoming Legislature. Next week's show looks just as packed, and we hope to see you then. Thanks for joining us, and have a good evening.
This program is supported in part by a grant from the BNSF Railway Foundation, dedicated to improving the general welfare and quality of life in communities throughout the BNSF Railway service area. Proud to support Wyoming PBS.
By a grant from AARP, serving the needs and providing real possibilities for the over 50 population in Wyoming. AARP Wyoming, proud to support Wyoming PBS.
And by Wyoming Humanities, celebrating our heritage, strengthening our democracy, and growing Wyoming's creative and cultural economy for over 50 years. Visit thinkwy.org.